Buonasera a tutti, siamo qui all'Hotel Savoia, ringraziamo i proprietari Anna Maria, Rosa Maria Gargiulo e Giuseppe Savarese. Stavo pensando alla nostra carissima Anna Maria Gargiulo che è morta e che ha lasciato un grande vuoto all'interno dell'Istituto. Allora, oggi siamo con la professoressa Daphne Grace, che è famosa perché è stata da noi già 4-5 volte. Lo scorso anno presentò il libro che lei aveva scritto su Sorrento, se non sbaglio, ed eravamo con Silvana Gargiulo dell'ufficio comunale per quanto riguarda i rapporti internazionali. Oggi la professoressa Daphne Grace ci parlerà di qualcosa che sta diventando sempre più diffuso. Shakespeare, chi è? È un mistero? È un poeta veramente esistito? È una serie di poeti? Vedremo che cosa ci dirà la professoressa Daphne Grace, che insegna letteratura inglese, almeno insegnava letteratura inglese all'Università di Brighton. Lei parlerà in inglese e io tradurrò delle cose a fine discussione, a fine della sua conferenza, leggerò gli appunti che lei ha scritto. Quindi passo la parola a Daphne, grazie.
Buonasera a tutti. Il mistero di Shakespeare, un uomo o un mito? Tutti pensiamo di conoscere Shakespeare. Possiamo forse citare le sue parole e le sue espressioni, ma chi era davvero Shakespeare? Famoso poeta, drammatico, attore, scrittore di oltre 150 sonetti, ma quanto sappiamo davvero di lui? Negli ultimi 100 anni di ricerche, gli studiosi non sono stati in grado di produrre una sola prova di colleghi l'autori di Stratford con l'autore delle opere teatrali e delle poesie. Ma non è una sola parola sopravvive nella sua calligrafia. Nessuno lo associava alla letteratura o alla scrittura di alcun tipo. Conosciamo solo alcuni fatti precisi su Shakespeare. E poi parlo in inglese e poi in italiano. So we know very, very little about Shakespeare, the man. We know his words, we know his plays. They've all been played, obviously, around the world. But Shakespeare has been called by a historian a shadow in his own biography. There is not a more tempting void in literary history. We know nothing about him. Not one, for example, of the actor's contemporaries ever associated the actor William Shakespeare with ever having written anything. We only know very few facts about Shakespeare. We don't know what day he was born, but we do know he was baptized in the church the 26th of April, 1564. His father was a wool merchant and he was illiterate. The father could not read or write. He married at the age of 18 to a woman of 26, a little bit older than him, because she was already pregnant with his child. So we know they had 3 children because their names were, they baptized and they're in the church. We know he travelled from Stratford-on-Avon to London, but we don't know which year. We know he died and he was buried and he left a will. But that's all we know. We don't know anything else. So we want to talk a little bit today about why does there seem to be such a problem. Obviously, there was an actor called William Shakespeare, but did he write anything at all? There are so many problems around the fact that an uneducated actor who was probably illiterate, in other words, he could read, but he couldn't write, how could he possibly have known about all the topics that the plays are about and all the places that are mentioned? And you can't really see, but I have a piece of paper here. The only things that we have in William's handwriting are in fact scissors. That's all we have that are in his handwriting. And it's not very clear from this, because they're not very clear anyway. But if I just show the audience, if I pass this round, you'll see each of those signatures, the name is spelt differently and it's different handwriting. So probably it was a clerk or somebody at the church maybe who actually signed his name for him because he couldn't write. So I'll just pass that round, people can have a look. So there are some things that seem quite strange because the man who wrote the plays was obviously, he was an expert in the arts and sciences, philosophy, many languages. He knew about the law, he knew about the manners of the royal court of Queen Elizabeth. He knew about sport of nobles, particularly falconry, the birds, flying the birds. He knew about magic, painting, European history, and most essentially, he knew about Italy. And what I really want to focus on today, since we're in Italy, is Shakespeare in Italy and how a young man who lived in Stratford-on-Avon, how could he possibly have known so much about Italy with never having been there? So we know Shakespeare lived in only the two places, Stratford and London, and there is no record at all of him ever having any education. There's no record in Stratford Grammar School with his name in it. It's just assumed by experts and by scholars that he must have gone to school. Surely he went to school, and he must have gone to school in Stratford. But one of the things I want to talk about, obviously, is his use of sources. So many of Shakespeare's stories originally came from Italian stories. For example, Measure for Measure and Othello were both based on plays from the Ferrara writer Giovanni Battista Giraldi. And Shakespeare had obviously read these plays. Now, there is only one problem. They had never been translated into English, and they were only available, the books, the texts were only available in Italy. They were not available in England. So whoever wrote the plays and used that as his source material clearly had been and found these books in Italy. As I was saying, there's nothing in his handwriting. There's no play, there's no text that actually it says, by William Shakespeare. Unlike other writers at the time. We know, for example, Queen Elizabeth I spoke 7 or 8 languages, she translated, she wrote letters, and all of those things still exist. We can go to a library, a museum, and read her letters, read what she wrote. But absolutely nothing in Shakespeare's handwriting at all. And similarly, none of his colleagues, no contemporaries of Shakespeare's, ever linked Shakespeare's name with anything written. And the only comment, in fact, nobody comments about Shakespeare at all. The only comment we have about Shakespeare is a very famous quote by one of his contemporaries, Robert Greene, who famously wrote that the actor William Shakespeare is an upstart crow, which refers to a story in Aesop's Fables, and the crow was a character who was always stealing from other people. So was the actor somebody who stole all his material from somebody else? So for more than 100 years, scholars have been arguing about who was Shakespeare, and really this became much more dramatic, and the debate really heated up when Sigmund Freud became interested. And so he did a lot of research, and obviously into the sort of the mentality, the mind of Shakespeare, who wrote the plays. And so since the time of Freud, really, it's been a very central debate, and the answers have not been found yet. But there have been many ideas for who Shakespeare may have been, including now 2 women. Some people think Shakespeare was probably a woman, either Mary Sidney or Emilia Bassano. And other writers, of course, famously Francis Bacon, who was already a famous playwright, William Stanley, the 6th Earl of Derby, Christopher Marlowe, of course, who was another famous playwright, and also Edward de Vere, who was the 17th Earl of Oxford, who was an aristocrat and a great favourite of Queen Elizabeth I. And so for the rest of the talk, really, I'm going to be talking about who I think Shakespeare was, and that is Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, because everything in his biography seems to suggest that he had all the experience necessary to write the plays and to be able to create the characters and so on, because as somebody said, as soon as we start thinking about Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, as Shakespeare, suddenly all the Shakespeare plays seem to look like autobiography. So there are many, perhaps, coincidences, too many coincidences for them to be coincidences. For example, there's a wonderful study by an American scholar who spent many years doing his PhD with a copy of the Earl of Oxford's Bible. And the Earl of Oxford, his Bible with his name in it, had been many times underlined particular texts, passages in the Bible, quotes from the Bible, or he made comments in the margin. And this PhD spent many years looking through, and he found, the scholar found, that there was a 100% match between the Bible passages that are mentioned in Shakespeare and the passages, the lines that are underlined in Oxford's personal Bible, which seems absolutely extraordinary. And then there are other coincidences, if you like. He knew a lot about Italy. He visited Italy. He was obviously knew all about the life of the court. He was a close associate of Queen Elizabeth I. And I'd like to just, as I said, focus on some of the ideas of some of the plays that mention his own experiences, and also some of the places that he visited in Italy. And just to say a little bit about his upbringing, he was born into a noble family in the year 1550, and he was educated at Cambridge University, took a degree, and then he studied law in London and became a lawyer. And he was a favourite, as I said, of Queen Elizabeth. Then he joined the army to fight against Scotland, married a very suitable young woman and had children. And then in 1575, which seems to be a key year, he was given permission by Queen Elizabeth to travel to Europe, so going first through France and Germany, and went to Italy, so that by the spring of that year, he arrives from Paris. He arrives in Padua, and then lives for about 6 months in Venice, visits Florence, Rome, and goes all the way down to Palermo and Messina in Sicily. And when we start thinking about some of the Shakespeare plays, we know Messina features in one of the plays, definitely Rome, Julius Caesar. There are 5 of Shakespeare's plays that are set in Rome. Florence, Verona, Venice, all of these cities that he knew so well. There are very, very details about those cities that are in the Shakespeare plays. Only somebody who had visited those cities could possibly have known some of those details. For example, in one of the plays he mentions that the characters had reached Padua by boat, and everybody in England went, no, it couldn't possibly have gone by boat. But yes, they could, because the rivers in those days were used as central transport between the cities in Italy. So he was a great supporter. Back in England, he was a great supporter of the theatre. He paid for 2 different troupes of actors to work. And I'm just going to look at some of the other coincidences. Between De Vere and Shakespeare. There's a list, I've actually got a list here of the plays, and there are 17 of Shakespeare's plays that are set in Italy. So just to give some examples, obviously, of Othello in Venice, The Two Gentlemen of Verona, Romeo and Juliet, Verona, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra, Titus Andronicus are all in Rome. The Taming of the Shrew is Padua. All's Well That Ends Well, Firenze. The Tempest is Naples. Much Ado About Nothing, Messina and Sicily. And The Winter's Tale, partly in Sicily. And when we look then at the English plays, actually less of Shakespeare's plays are set in England, more are set in Italy. But interestingly, I think for us as well with the Tasso Institute, and something that not many people have asked the question, but the question I would like to ask is, if Shakespeare is the Earl of Oxford, and the Earl of Oxford was in Ferrara, he was in Venice, he was in Padua, at exactly the same time that Torquato Tasso was in Ferrara. And the year that he was travelling in Italy, which was 1575 to 1576. Now, for Tasso experts, the year 1576 will ring a bell, because that's the year that Gerusalemme Liberata was first read by the court. It wasn't yet published, but it was being read by everybody in the Duke of Ferrara's court in Ferrara. And it was the same year that, Tasso was already having problems and was being, for the first time, helped, shall we say, by put into the Santa Anna Institute, isn't it, in Firenze? Ferrara, yes, not Ferrara, exactly. So I would like to conjecture, we don't have any proof, but what if the Earl of Oxford was in Ferrara? He was there in the same year that Tasso. He must have heard of Tasso. Everybody would have been talking about this wonderful poem that had just, ready for publication, but it was published without his consent. So, and this is the same year that this man, who is avid reader, who loves the arts, he's passionate about Italy. Why would he not have read it or heard the story about this wonderful, brilliant genius, and now he's having mental health problems and in the hospital and so on. And we know from other colleagues in the Institute that there are such close similarities between the play of Hamlet, and was Hamlet based on some of the story of Tasso's madness. And obviously in Hamlet, the madness is both perhaps real and pretend. It's a technique for Hamlet to protect himself by saying, I'm going to pretend I'm mad. And, so that's, was that partly what happened with Tasso, that to protect himself in the court, he, we don't know all those things anyway, but I'd like to suggest that, the connection between Hamlet and Tasso, maybe that is part of the links between, the Earl of Oxford, if he wrote the play, and bringing some of Tasso into the Hamlet story. And there are also other extraordinary coincidences in the Hamlet story with the Earl of Oxford's real life. For example, on the way back, when he was travelling back from Italy to England, he was attacked by pirates. All his clothes were taken from him, and he was just dumped on the beach in England. And that's exactly what happens in Hamlet. The characters say, we've just been attacked by pirates and all our clothes, this is Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, this is what happens to them. And they tell the story of being attacked by pirates. And another coincidence was that the Earl of Oxford's brother-in-law was a diplomat, was the British ambassador in Elsinore, the court of Denmark. So there are all these sort of family connections. So that's sort of two different stories. Was the Earl of Oxford aware of Tasso? Did they meet? And how much of his own story did he bring into the plays? So I find this very exciting, and it's a question that a lot of people are getting very emotional about in England as well. It's quite controversial, questioning who exactly was Shakespeare. People get very upset, and so I just think this link with Tasso, perhaps that will make it more concrete and more set in an Italian context, that this man who wrote 17 plays about Italy and set in Italy, and as I said, a lot of the sources were from Italian texts. They weren't original. I mean, we know Romeo and Juliet. I mean, that was a story long being told in Italy before Shakespeare came along and told his story of it. And some of the places I'm just going to mention another example, some details. For example, when he was in Venice, because he was a very aristocratic nobleman from England, he was introduced to the Doge, and the Doge invited him. He was allowed to go into the very private rooms in the Doge's palace to see all those amazing paintings. You've probably all been there and seen the Titian and Tintoretto and all these amazing paintings in the Doge's secret private rooms. And the Earl of Oxford mentions those. He'd seen them. So he was greatly honoured when he was in Italy. He was called the Milord de Oxford, or the Conte di Oxford. And when he went back to England after living for 18 months, about 18 months in Italy, he was wearing Italian clothes. He was very using Italian manners and customs, and did not any longer behave like an Englishman. And everybody laughed at him, and they called him the little Italian man, because he was so, even after just 18 months in Italy, he had become so Italian. And I like to think that he was quite an eccentric, that he didn't really, he really did what he wanted to do. He didn't really care to conform. So anyway, just to go back to Tasso a little bit, in the same year, just what was Tasso doing in 1576? He was actually also travelling. In November, he went to Florence, to Rome, then he was in Siena and Florence, and then back to Ferrara in January of 76. And it's in 1576 that Tasso hears about this pirated version of Gerusalemme Liberata, which added to his anger and his suspicions about his enemies. And interestingly as well, it's believed that another poet, another very famous British poet, Sir Philip Sidney, he visited Padua. He came to Italy and visited Padua and Ferrara, especially to come and find Tasso. So the English poets in England did know about Tasso. They did know about his work. And Spencer also knew about Tasso's work and mentioned him in letters to other writers. So obviously those letters still exist. And the first translations of the Liberata appeared in 1594. So the Earl of Oxford was still alive, and they were published in both English and Italian in England. So all the poets in England did know about Tasso. And it's also interesting that in 1602, which is just after the Earl of Oxford, actually 1604 the Earl of Oxford died, 1602, Hamlet was first produced at the Globe Theatre in London. And in that very same year, a play called Tasso's Melancholia was performed in London. So people could go and see Tasso in the very same season in London in the theatre. You could go and see, you could see Hamlet, and then you could go and see Tasso's Melancholia. It's two different plays, and think, they seem quite similar. And after Tasso's death as well, the stories about his madness, stories about his life, were avidly circulating in England, because he was, two communities like now, the Italians and the British, the cultures are so enriched and enmeshed. But even in those days, in the early, very early days of the 17th century, that was already happening. So could Edward de Vere have written Shakespeare's plays? I think yes. But a lot of people, obviously, this is very controversial. Could Tasso have met de Vere, the Earl of Oxford? Possibly. They were both in the same area of Italy at the same time. Perhaps one day we'll know the answers to these mysteries. But in Hamlet's words, the very substance is merely the shadow of a dream. So all of life is just the shadow of a dream. So how can we ever really know the truth? And so several scholars have suggested, Shakespeare, William Shakespeare, is just a pseudonym, just a pen name. It could be for a man, it could be a woman, it could be a group of people who got together and all wrote under the name William Shakespeare. And he was a real man. William Shakespeare was a real man. He was an actor. He seems to have been quite a good actor. And at the end of William Shakespeare's life, he didn't write anymore. By the time the Earl of Oxford died, William Shakespeare didn't produce any more plays. Seems a little bit strange. And but William Shakespeare went back to Stratford, bought a very big house. He was very, very wealthy. Now, where did that money come from? Because no other playwright in England made as much money as Shakespeare by writing plays. The money came from somewhere else, and we don't know where. And then Shakespeare was buried in Stratford, and then there are all these mysteries about the grave, because they've done, DNA analysis, and they've looked in the grave of Shakespeare. Nothing in there, absolutely empty. So the man seems to be, like that quote, a little bit of a shadow, and he remains a shadow. So it's up to us to decide
Can I make
what
some
we
question?
believe. Please, do you
finish your...
Yes, that I finished.
Yeah, because in Italy is coming out a new theory.
Yes.
That first is a group of writers who wrote all the book of Shakespeare. Because from the time they come out and the time they finish, it's quite impossible for only one writer to write all these books.
Yes, and also they're so different. The plays are, some of them are really, they're sort of funny, they're rude, they're for people not very intelligent maybe, just fun. There's the comedies, a lot of the comedies are just very simple plays. And then you have these incredibly complex psychological, thriller, murder, mystery thrillers that are so complicated. How can only one person have really written all these different things?
The Italians, they're making an idea who could be one of these writers. And they suggested the name John Florio.
Oh, okay.
That he was the son of a reformist that escaped from Italy and went to England. He had a big culture. And John Florio had a super culture. And also he knew Tasso, he knew all the books. And he was friend of Giordano Bruno. And I'm not an expert on this situation.
No,
but what I remember, they published a book. They say that Giordano Bruno said to John Florio that he was writing with a different name. And he should have continued to do what he was doing, write poem. And also Florio knew very well Torquato Tasso, knew very well all Italy. He was a Sicilian family, so that he traveled all over Italy. So I knew Messina because it's so difficult
Yes.
to know the things of the Messina things. About the melancholy of Tasso. I think it came out before when Tasso was still alive.
Oh, yes, probably.
Yeah,
Yes, it would be. Yes,
I
it
think
would
it was
be.
like Giampiero Giampieri wrote. It came out in the 1780, I think.
Yes. So by the time it was in London, it was.
Queen Elizabeth was one of the crazy writers of Torquato Tasso.
She loved him, didn't she? Yeah.
She read in Italian.
Yes.
She was reading the books of Tasso in Italian.
Yeah.
And she was, what they say, and she was asking the ambassador of Ferrara in the court of England, always news about Torquato Tasso. And also, she cannot believe that a genius like Tasso was closed in a prison.
Right, exactly.
She was always saying how it's possible.
Exactly.
Genius like him. You got this luck to have a poet like him in your court.
And I believe Queen Elizabeth wanted Tasso to come to London to be.
Maybe, yes.
And she was saying, I don't have any decent poets. I want Tasso to come over. And she had Sir Philip Sidney, Spenser, Shakespeare, some absolutely amazing. Amelia Bassano was writing amazing sonnets. And she said, they're all rubbish. I want Tasso to come over from Italy. So, which obviously never happened.
You are saying things that they are very similar to one Giampieri is telling,
Well, that's why I sort of hint at what some of the other people have
and also,
presented, and also Jeremy.
And also, if you read The Tempest,
of
Shakespeare,
yes.
and you read the Torrismondo, there are so many similarities.
Well, I have a list of sort of what the sources were, but I didn't read all of those out. But which Italian work then became one of the Shakespeare plays. So it's easy to sort of trace. We know what all the sources were. I mean, they were all published works.
It's coming out these things that.
But I didn't know about John Florio.
Yeah, many writers they wrote the books. So I think this is real, and could be De Vere.
Yes.
Could be De Vere. Could be Florio. Could be all.
Well, they could all just a group of friends, and they just paid this actor to use his name. So they were safe, because one of the reasons, people say Oxford, De Vere's friends, there are all these letters and comments saying, Edward De Vere writes such fantastic plays. They're so great, they're so funny. He writes these amazing comedies and wonderful plays. But we don't have any plays that exist with Edward De Vere's name on them. But we know he was writing plays because all his friends talk about these great plays that he's writing. And so one theory, and it's only a theory, is that, for an aristocrat, for somebody who's very close to the Queen and a courtier, it wouldn't be at all suitable to put your name on a text, because that would be very, it would devalue your status. If you just said, I've written this play, if you're a nobleman in the court of the Queen, you don't write plays, you don't write sonnets.
It seems
it would be, you're more.
Understand?
Yeah, you understand what I'm saying.
But
yes, it would degrade your status anyway to do that.
Also, John Florio was in the court of the Queen Elizabeth. Mm-hmm. I don't know what rule he had, but he was very, very close. And,
I have to read more, I don't know. Yeah. Thank you, Luciano, because I want to read more about that.
Ok. E allora spiego un po' in italiano quello che ha detto, ma spero che tutti gli spettatori comprendano l'inglese. La professoressa Daphne Grace sostiene che, come oramai sta diventando luogo comune, che Shakespeare, l'attore Shakespeare, non può essere lo stesso che ha scritto tutti questi racconti, queste novelle, per due motivi, per un motivo molto preciso. Prima perché era una persona che non sapeva leggere.
He could read, non scrivere.
Ma sapeva...
non sapeva scrivere.
Allora non sapeva scrivere.
Ma infatti, leggere, certo leggere.
Perché come si vede dalle firme che ha lasciato, non ce n'è una uguale. E quella che sembra sicura, sembra di uno che proprio non sa scrivere. Per cui lei parla di questa opportunità che ci sono stati diversi scrittori che hanno potuto scrivere sotto il nome di Shakespeare e ha fatto il nome. Ma secondo lei quello più probabile è questo duca di Oxford,
Edward de Vere.
Edward de Vere, che ha viaggiato in Italia, ha conosciuuto l'Italia e ha conosciuto anche Torquato Tasso. Forse. No, ma l'ha conosciuto leggendolo,
sì.
l'ha conosciuto in questo senso qua.
Sì.
Forse l'ha pure è andato a trovarlo, ma questo non si sa. Però le opere le conosceva. Era un uomo di corte, la regina Elisabetta ammirava Tasso, quindi un po' è tutto, è chiaro che se uno scrive, specialmente in quel periodo, cerca di compiacere la persona poi che è a capo dello Stato, cioè la regina amava Tasso, il duca di Oxford cercava di scrivere in quel modo là e si documentava sui racconti e le opere che aveva scritto Tasso, e per cui porta tutta una serie di riferimenti, per cui lei è certa che dovrebbe essere questo qua, ma lascia aperto anche il dubbio che possono essere stati in tanti. Cioè, questo ha scritto una parte considerevole delle opere, ma ci possono essere stati anche altri scrittori che abbiano insieme scritto sotto questo nome di Shakespeare. Porta anche altre due teorie, secondo lei, che questo duca di Oxford era molto ricco e quindi questa ricchezza gli poteva venire proprio dalla diffusione delle opere che erano state incredibilmente di successo in Inghilterra in quel periodo, ed è sepolto, comprò una casa a Stratford-upon-Avon, ho capito bene? Sì, ha comprato anche una casa dove è pure sepolto il duca di Oxford. Is buried there.
The Conte di Oxford is buried in Westminster Abbey.
Okay.
Yeah, in Londra, in Westminster Abbey. So,
è di sicuro una cosa, quando lui è morto sono finite le opere di Shakespeare, non c'è stata più quella
more or less.
Vabbè, perché abbiamo detto che potrebbero essere tanti scrittori.
Yes, the last few years of Shakespeare's life he wrote nothing. He just went home to Stratford and lived as a wealthy man, just enjoyed life.
Questo il duca di Oxford o l'attore Oxford, l'attore Shakespeare?
The actor Shakespeare.
Oh, the actor Shakespeare. He went back home
and by that time, yes, the Earl of Oxford had died because he was a little bit older than the actor.
Quindi terminiamo questa conferenza lasciando un dubbio ancora più aperto, perché come voi sapete noi abbiamo tenuto una grande conferenza da parte di diversi professori, tra cui Marianna Iannaccone, che è una grande studiosa di John Florio, specialmente nei rapporti con Giordano Bruno, la quale aveva lanciato questa idea che forse uno di questi scrittori, che ha vissuto anche lui alla corte di Elisabetta e che forse ha conosciuto questo duca di Oxford. Forse. Perché tutti gli studi sono talmente aperti che oggi si comincia a discutere di questo problema, perché fino a 15 anni fa non c'erano dubbi che lo scrittore era l'attore ed era certo, perché anche in questa conferenza che noi facemmo uscì fuori questa idea che in Inghilterra con la nascita dell'impero si era creato questo scrittore per supportare la cultura inglese, per darle un respiro maggiore. E quindi questa era stata una scoperta di uno studioso inglese che aveva scoperto Shakespeare dopo che era caduto nell'oblio e aveva cominciato a pubblicare tutto questo corpo di opere incredibili e aveva creato come una specie di, come dire, una base culturale per l'impero inglese, perché nessun regno, nessuno stato, nessun impero si può reggere solo sul potere. se non ha anche una base culturale, per dire noi siamo degni di poter governare il mondo, perché siamo tra i migliori. Questo era accaduto anche a Napoli quando Gioacchino Murat divenne re di Napoli. Lui intravide in questa opportunità in Torquato Tasso proprio. Infatti voleva portare le spoglie di Tasso da Roma a Sorrento e dare corpo a questo suo regno con questo grande poeta, perché non si può creare uno Stato se non c'è una forte cultura. Infatti noi sappiamo, leggevo proprio ieri, su Sparta, noi non abbiamo un poeta a Sparta, non abbiamo un filosofo a Sparta, abbiamo solo guerrieri. Infatti Sparta è finita. Atene invece, che era un luogo dove c'erano poeti, filosofi, ancora oggi esiste. Quindi è molto importante, io credo, avere una base culturale per dominare il mondo.
Sì, sì.
E con questo termino. Ringrazio Daphne di essere venuta anche oggi, quest'anno da noi, come oramai è una tua abitudine. Sono 3 anni che vieni per il 25 aprile. Esatto?
Sì, sì. 4-5 anni. Sì,
Okay.
sì, sono
la ringraziamo, sperando di averla il prossimo anno. Grazie a tutti.
Grazie Luciano.
Grazie.